When most people think about the history of Iran, they immediately think of Persia, Cyrus the Great, Persepolis, or the great empires that once stretched from Egypt to Central Asia. But if we begin the story only with the Persian Empire, we miss the deepest layer of the subject. Iran is not only the history of a state, it is, first of all, the history of a very old civilizational space, where multiple layers of peoples, languages, and beliefs accumulated over thousands of years. The land we now call Iran lies on a vast plateau, framed by mountains, deserts, and corridors, linking it to Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. That geography made it both a bridge and a battlefield. This region was never isolated from the ancient world. On the contrary, it stood in the path of major movements of trade, war, and cultural exchange. Very early on, in the southwest of present-day Iran, Elam emerged as an ancient political power centered around Susa. At several points, Elam directly competed with the great powers of Mesopotamia. That matters because it shows that the history of Iran was not merely a side chapter of Mesopotamian history. It was one of the parallel centers of development in the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence also suggests that complex settled communities existed in parts of Iranian territory very early, with enough craft production, ritual life, and social organization to lay foundations for later state formation. Later, Indo-Iranian-speaking groups moved south onto the plateau and mixed with the populations already living there. Out of this long process emerged the communities that would later be known as the Medes and the Persians. This was not a simple replacement of one population by another. It was a long fusion between newcomers and earlier cultures. For that reason, what we call Iran was never entirely uniform from the beginning. It was the result of accumulation, mixture, and reorganization. That is also the key to understanding everything that came later. Iran did not survive simply because it was always militarily stronger than its enemies. Iran survived because, from an early stage, it was a space capable of absorbing difference, transforming it, and reorganizing it into something durable. Before it became an empire, Iran was already a civilization that knew how to endure in the middle of collision. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is the true root of its long historical resilience. If we look at Iranian history only through dynasties, wars, and changing rulers, we see a land repeatedly shaken by upheaval. But beneath that instability, there was something more enduring than armies or borders, a worldview that helped ancient Iranians understand their place in the universe and in history. One of the most important elements in the study of Iranian identity is Zoroastrianism. Although scholars still debate the exact dates associated with Zarathustra and the precise extent of Zoroastrian influence on later religions, one point is reasonably clear. This tradition played a major role in shaping the moral and political imagination of ancient Iran. In that worldview, life was not simply an endless cycle of meaningless repetition. It was understood as a meaningful struggle between truth and falsehood, order and chaos, light and darkness. The point here is not to reduce Iranian history to a simple story of good versus evil, but to recognize that ancient Iranians often imagined themselves as a community with a role in defending cosmic and moral order. That way of thinking created a strong connection between religion, ethics, and kingship. A ruler was not expected to govern by force alone. He was also expected to uphold justice, order, and harmony against disorder. This is one reason why later Iranian empires, especially under the Achaemenids and the Sasanians, were able to build durable systems of rule across large and diverse territories. Many scholars have also argued that ideas such as final judgment, the ultimate struggle between good and evil, and a historical movement toward an endpoint were articulated early in the Iranian religious world. However, this should be presented carefully. It is better not to say that Iran single-handedly invented linear time as an absolute fact. A more accurate formulation is that ancient Iranian thought, especially through Zoroastrianism, may have contributed significantly to later West Asian ideas about history, apocalypse, and moral order. What matters most is this: when a people believes that history has meaning, they can often endure defeat more effectively. They may lose a battle, a dynasty, or even a capital city, yet still believe that their story is not over. In Iran's case, that confidence in a deeper order beyond immediate political collapse may help explain why this civilization repeatedly reappeared after periods of destruction. When Cyrus the Great rose in the 6th century BCE, he did not simply create a new empire. He and his successors helped build a model of rule, flexible enough to govern an enormous space filled with many peoples, languages, and religions. That is why the Achaemenid Empire is often regarded as one of the first superpowers of the ancient world. What made this empire distinctive was not just the scale of its territory. Equally important was the way it functioned. Rather than enforcing total uniformity everywhere, the Persian imperial model often allowed local communities to retain their customs, beliefs, and elites, as long as they accepted imperial authority and paid tribute. This policy was not always gentle or ideal, but compared with many conquest-based systems of the ancient world, it was highly practical and often more sustainable. Under Darius I, the imperial administration became more structured through satrapies, roads, taxation, and communication networks. This was a major turning point. Iran was no longer simply the homeland of the Persians. It became the center of an imperial system capable of managing diversity on an unprecedented scale. From this period onward, the image of the Iranian ruler as King of Kings became a lasting political idea. This title did not only express ambition, it reflected the structure of an empire made up of many subordinate lands that were connected without being fully assimilated. In other words, Persian power did not rest on making every region identical. It rested on placing many different worlds under one shared framework of order. The wars with the Greek city-states are often presented in popular Western history as a struggle between freedom and despotism. But that interpretation is far too simple. In reality, the Greeks and Persians represented different political models, and both had strengths and limitations. Even though Persia did not fully subdue the Greek world, the Achaemenid Empire remained one of the dominant powers of its age for a long time. What matters here is that when the Achaemenid Empire eventually fell to Alexander, the model of rule the Persians had built did not disappear completely. Many of its elements survived and were reused by later dynasties. This is one of the key features of Iranian history. Dynasties may collapse, but habits of administration, symbolic language, and memories of imperial order endure. That memory meant that each collapse in Iran was rarely a final ending. More often, it became a transformation. Iranian history contains many serious military defeats. The Achaemenid Empire was conquered by Alexander. Later, the Arabs overthrew the Sasanian state. Then came the devastation of the Mongols and Timur. If we look only at the military level, it becomes difficult to explain how a civilization that suffered so many shocks could still preserve a recognizable identity. Part of the answer may be that Iran did not defend itself only through armies. It also possessed an ability to shape those who came to rule it. In other words, Iran often lost on the battlefield first, but regained influence later through culture, administration, language, and prestige. After Alexander's conquest, the Hellenistic world extended deeply into the east. Yet, the successor states that ruled Iranian lands could not govern those territories through purely Macedonian or Greek forms alone. By the time of the Parthians, and later the Sasanians, political patterns with strong Iranian features had returned in force. The idea of the ruler as King of Kings, the importance of court ceremony, and the memory of earlier Persian Empire all re-emerged in new forms. After the Arab conquest in the 7th century, Iran gradually became part of the Islamic world, and this was obviously a profound transformation. But becoming Islamic did not mean being fully dissolved into an Arab identity. Over the centuries that followed, New Persian reasserted itself as a major language of literature, thought, and administration. Many Islamic courts across West and Central Asia operated under strong Persian cultural influence. The Mongol period brought even greater destruction. Cities were ruined, populations massacred, and economic systems shattered. Yet, within a few generations, Mongol rulers in Iran were using Persian, sponsoring Persian art, supporting Persian scholars, and adopting Iranian models of kingship and courtly culture. This does not mean that the Mongols simply became Iranian in a complete sense. It means that they entered a political and cultural environment in which Iranian traditions had tremendous prestige and practical value. That is what makes Iran so striking historically. It was not that Iran was never defeated, it was defeated many times. What was unusual is that even after defeat, the society often retained a cultural core strong enough to force new rulers to govern through it. This was a kind of soft power long before the term existed. And it helps explain why Iran could repeatedly lose states without losing itself. If one period deserves special attention for shaping the outline of modern Iran, it is probably the Safavid era, beginning in 1501 under Shah Ismail I. Before that point, Iran already had a long history, an imperial memory, a distinct literary culture, and an important role in the Islamic world. But under the Safavids, many of those scattered elements were consolidated into a more clearly defined political identity. The most important development was the adoption of Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion. This was a decisive turning point. Before the Safavids, much of the broader Islamic world in this region was predominantly Sunni, and Iran itself had not always had the Shia profile it has today. The Safavid policy was therefore not only a religious decision, it was also a state-building project. By tying the state to Shiism, the Safavids created a sharp line between Iran and the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west. That difference was both theological and geopolitical. Iran was no longer only the land once associated with ancient Persia. It became a political center with a distinct identity inside the Islamic world. This would remain one of the deepest foundations of how Iran understood itself, and it also helps explain some of the long-term regional tensions that emerged later. At the same time, this transformation should not be romanticized. The Shiization of Iran was not a smooth or entirely consensual process. It involved coercion, conflict, and large-scale restructuring of society. It was not simply a natural consensus from the start, but over time, it helped create a more unified religious and symbolic framework than many earlier periods had achieved. The Safavids also played a major role in restoring Iran as a center of art, architecture, ceremony, and royal symbolism. Isfahan became the emblem of an Iran that was both Islamic and Persian, where pre-Islamic memories did not disappear entirely but were recast within a new framework. That point is essential. Iran did not survive by preserving the past unchanged. It survived by rewriting the past in forms that could serve the present. From that perspective, the Safavid period was more than just the reign of a strong dynasty. It was the moment when Iran gave a sharper answer to the question of who it was. Once that answer took shape, Iran entered the modern era, not as a random territory in the Middle East, but as a historical entity with clearer cultural, religious, and political boundaries. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, Iran faced a different kind of threat from the invasions of antiquity. This time, the danger did not come only from armies crossing frontiers. It came from a modern world order shaped by industrial empires. Russia and Britain competed for influence in Iran, extracted resources, interfered in politics, and reduced the country to a strategic buffer in the so-called Great Game. Iran was not erased, but it was pushed into dependency and often treated more as an object of rivalry than as an equal political subject. In that context, Reza Shah Pahlavi's request in 1935 that foreign governments use the name Iran carried great symbolic weight. In the West, Persia had long evoked a romantic and exotic image, ancient splendor, carpets, poetry, and a vaguely timeless East. Iran, by contrast, was the native name tied to the image of a modern sovereign nation that did not want to be trapped inside someone else's imagination. It is important to note that Persia was not simply a false name. It came from the way outsiders referred to the land through their association with Pars, the historic center of the Persians. But the shift to Iran reveals something deeper than language. A nation does not struggle only to survive, it also struggles to be named on its own terms. Then the 1979 revolution created yet another turning point. Iran's global image changed dramatically. Since then, Iran has often appeared in international discourse alongside sanctions, geopolitical tension, conflict, and ideological confrontation. Meanwhile, Persia has remained alive in global culture as a symbol of poetry, art, refinement, and lost grandeur. The two names have long ceased to be merely labels. They represent two different ways of seeing the same country. And that may be the most fitting way to end this 5,000-year story. Iran did not survive because it always defeated its enemies. Many times, it did not. Many times, it was broken apart. But across those centuries, it preserved something more durable than uninterrupted power: the ability to redefine itself more strongly than the outside world could define it. From Elam to the Achaemenids, from the Sasanians to the Safavids, from Persia to Iran, what endured most was not a fixed border but a repeated capacity for cultural reconstruction. The history of Iran is therefore not a myth about a people who were never brought down. It is something more believable and in many ways more impressive: the story of a civilization that could collapse more than once and still rise again in a new form while continuing to recognize itself.